All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome. We are now in module six of the cognitive workshop for the winter 2025. Um, I hope everyone had a fantastic Valentine's Day. And so the topic for today is a continuation from what we were talking about last week, which was executive functions, planning, and issues similar to that. And so this week we're talking about cognitive communication, social cognition, some things that require really a lot of cognitive ability, right? I really don't think that for most times it doesn't really get as much credence as it should, but to have effective communication with social interactions and relationships is incredibly difficult. And there are a lot of things that happen with social cognition, and there are many pitfalls for it, right? So before we get in, disclaimer as always, right? So the opinions voiced in this workshop are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect those of Providence St. Jude Medical Center. The content provided in this workshop is for informational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. Please consult with a healthcare professional for advice regarding any medical condition or treatment. And so confidentiality, while not mandated, please keep any and all information shared amongst attendees confidential and within this virtual room. If any information is shared that makes anyone reasonably suspicious that abuse of a child, elder, or dependent adult is occurring, I must break the confidentiality in those circumstances. And for Zoom etiquette, please remember to mute your microphone when you are not speaking to reduce the background noise. And if you would like to ask a question or raise your hand, please use the hand raise function at the bottom of your screen. I will also periodically pause for open up for questions. Otherwise, please use the chat function to type in any questions or chat with other attendees. Sharing of any and all resources is greatly, that's 3 grades, appreciated, right? So and the recording, of course, as a reminder, these meetings will be recorded, as well as each of the 12 morning sessions in the series. There's also an afternoon session that is longer than 1 hour and will not be recorded to facilitate discussion amongst ourselves. Should you be more comfortable with attending that later session instead. The recording will become available as soon as possible via email and via our YouTube channel. The recording will only be in presenter mode, so only share presenter mode. So no one's video will be shared, and your voice will only be recorded if you speak. So if you are more comfortable, please use the chat function to answer questions and begin dialogue with other attendees. So perfect. At this point, we ask, what strategies have you implemented in your life, right? So we really want to emphasize and encourage the use of these strategies, and changing the environment, accommodating the environment, adapting the environment, so that way we can maximize post-injury adaptation, right? So as you think, here are some of the attention strategies that we've discussed over the past couple of weeks. And so one is the LEAP, conversation attention, right, strategy. And so LEAP is an acronym, and LEAP stands for L is to listen actively, E is to eliminate distractions, A is to then ask questions, and that will clarify your level of understanding. And P is to paraphrase, right? And you can after hearing someone speak, you can say, oh, okay, let me hear if I got you straight. You said X, Y, and Z, right? Or you can do what we were discussing, the reverse paraphrase, where you can ask, all right, after I just said A, B, and C, and so can you? I'm trying something new. Can you repeat back to me what you think you heard me say? And so just to evaluate the level of alignment with A, B, or C, or did they hear X, Y, and Z, right? So part of that is a metacognitive strategy. And metacognitive strategy is what we're going to be talking about. It will come up again today. So this is self-talk during your tasks or taking breaks. And for learning strategies, we have writing things down, right? Your journal or your notebook, right? Paraphrase to improve your memory. as we were talking about, consolidation requires encoding, and encoding essentially means for you to put some memory or some experience or some thought in your own words. And what's in your own words that highly increases the likelihood that you will consolidate it, label it, store it, or in an organized way so that it is available for retrieval when you need that information. And then there's association, right? Chunking. So it's easier to remember phone numbers if you break them up into zip code, first three, last four digits, right? So chunk them into pieces, categorize using acronyms, like we said, LEAP earlier, right? There's the rhymes, right? So things like if you can say, remember Sandy's name, like Sandy Reese is a neighbor. You can remember that by visualizing someone eating a Reese's candy bar on a sandy beach. Those are things that can help with visual imagery. Name lending strategies, sometimes it's part of just associating so that you can improve people's names, understanding names, as that will improve your overall success in social interactions, right? Especially when you can remember people's names. Not always easy, and it's not always easy to pay attention when they tell you their name in the first place, right? Then there's overlearning. So over these times, over your years, many golden years of living thus far, you've probably repeated your name a whole bunch of times. You've tied your shoes a whole bunch of times. You've said your address a whole bunch of times. And so this is the concept that with repetition, you will overlearn and have that information in your mind when you need it. And then the memory retrieval strategies we talked about in module 5. And so these are prospective memory strategies. So the prospective memory strategies that we've talked about this far, these are the things that you can do so that you can remember things in the future, right? So this is a home for your stuff, right? The keyring by your door, the decorative bowl by your bedstand, calendars, journals, alarms, reminders. I'm not going to go into each one of these. I think we've talked about these ad nauseum at some point, right? And also, if you have to remember to do something in the future, right, as we talked about, sometimes talking to yourself about the consequences of forgetting can add emotional value to the information you're trying to remember. And recall when we talked about the three concepts that are associated with improving your memories, improving that connection across your cortex, right? The best memory athletes are ones that can pull associations and relationships from all across the brain, right? Highly connected brain improves your memory, right? And so emotion was one of those enhanced components. Story was another one, and the third one was location, right? And that goes back to the home for your stuff or your automatic places. And of course, the can't miss reminders we talked about last week, putting your bag that you need tomorrow on the door handle so you're going to see it. Or, the dry erase marker in your bathroom, right? So you can write notes for yourself for the next morning on your window or on your mirror. Then there's the problem solving strategies. We talked about this last week, right? Executive function and problem solving. We talked about the D-BEST model, right? 6-step problem solving model. And D-BEST is an acronym that helps improve our prospective memory. And so D is define the problem, right? B is brainstorm solutions to the possible problem, and it will become easier if your problem is properly defined. So if you're having issues brainstorming solutions, then that's a good indication that your problem needs to be further defined. Then E is to evaluate each one of those solutions that you brainstormed. S is to select one of those solutions that you brainstormed. And then T is to try it. And then E is to evaluate again. What was the outcome? Was it a successful outcome? Was it not a successful outcome? Are there things that you can learn about the outcome? right? And all of these things are metacognitive strategies, which will ultimately improve your problem solving and your executive functions, right? So practice makes neuroplasticity. Right, perfect. And so self-talk while solving problems, right? And so this can, with the self-talking, can help reduce distractions. That way you are hearing yourself talk and it's blocking out the distractions. So sometimes self-talk when you're trying to solve problems can be helpful to reduce the amount of input that's happening from other places, so that way you can focus on your thinking. Next is hypothesis testing. So this is basically the try, evaluate, and then to self-monitor. So all of these are metacognitive strategies. And remember to plan using your calendar to meet your goals and those deadlines that you set, either 3-month goal, monthly goal, or weekly goal, right? And so every now and again, it's always good to go back and have a summary, a concise summary of the large amount of information that you go through in any given day, right? So in the past 5 weeks, 6 weeks now, those are the strategies that we've discussed, right? And so all of those are in service to improving your engagement in the community, right? And so that is so important, primarily because this workshop is a virtual workshop. Some components are in person if you come to the afternoon, but it's mostly a virtual workshop. And so I'm not in your home. I'm not, checking in on you daily. And some people probably wouldn't even want that. And so here, this is part of the process to, like, okay, self-regulating, self-monitoring, how am I doing day to day? And from that, evaluating the progress and the process that you're making in your goals, right? Or goal, right? Sometimes having goals, plural, is gets too messy, right? And so sometimes, in order to be effective, and yourself, right, it's way more productive to have a one-track goal mind first, and then finishing, and then moving on to the next one, right? So that way you're not getting too bogged down on all the details. So first is homework for this past week was to continue planning your full week in the calendar. So that's been the same homework assignment every week. Hopefully you're getting pro at it. And hopefully at this point, you're thinking in the back of your head, yes, I know, Daniel, you don't need to tell me to continue planning my week in the calendar again, right? So if you're saying that in your head, that means it's getting in there, and we're making progress. So perfect. Sound like a broken record, right? And so number 2, break down your 3-month goal into a monthly or weekly goal in your journal, right? And this is important. Self accountability, so that way you can improve your self monitoring. And then to practice at least one metacognitive strategy, which we'll talk about at the end. And then select one problem, right? Every week we all have 99 problems at least, and so we are to just select one and apply the D-BEST problem solving model to that problem. And if you find it to be successful, maybe you do too, right? And then number 5 for this week was to identify one relationship to invest some time in, right? And that could be a caregiver, that could be a loved one, it could be a friend, could be a coworker, could be a neighbor, or it could be yourself, right? And so the Associations with Brain Injury Symptoms questionnaire, love it. I appreciate everyone that filled it in, and I sent everyone's tables via email with each one of their scores, individual scores. So only you got to see your own score. And so I'd like to invite you to kind of maybe pull up that email right now and to look at it, and then we can answer individual questions, and then if you're not comfortable with doing so, just send me a message, and then we can set up a time to discuss them. So PCS stands for the pain catastrophizing scale. And so recall that catastrophizing is one of the 13 cognitive distortions that we reviewed was that last week? Yeah. And it is it is emphasizing negative consequences from a very limited amount of information and then having that generalized to other things. And so again, I'm going to review all of these scales and scores. And of course, I want to just emphasize these scores only mean to provide additional information like that. They kind of can answer some questions if you extrapolate them, but they are strictly here to provide you and us information, so that way we can better frame what are some things that are getting in the way when it comes to getting out every day, engaging the environment. Because like right behind this PowerPoint presentation, I'm doing some of the statistical analyses based on moderate to severe traumatic brain injury after 1 to 2 years. And the time after injury is an important factor in that. More time that elapses, there it interacts with the social services and the resources that are provided in their environment. So the more resources that are in the environment, the less behavioral disturbances are seen, if they can incorporate it into earlier on in their recovery. So even if you're a couple years out, it's never too late, right? So these scores are primarily just information to provide and contextualize some different barriers, right? That we can then take targeted action toward improving our engagement in our recovery. So pain catastrophizing has a number of scales. And so we'll talk about this here in just a moment. And so rumination, right? And so you'll see on your tables, your respective tables, there is the name of the scale on the far left column. Then there is the score, which doesn't mean much, right, without the interpretations in the next column, right? And so the next column or the last column is really a risk rating, right? So based on your scores, based on your answers, right, to those questions, these may be some issues, these may be a risk for you from low to high, like low. If there's WNL written anywhere, it stands for within normal limits. And then there's within normal limits, then moderate, low, moderate, and then high. So for rumination, this is when pain comes in and your tendency, right? So I'm saying and separating, right, to personify the brain, right? The brain injury symptoms, right? It's the brain injury symptoms have found their way to focus on and perseverate, right, on painful experiences. And when you have that tendency, when your brain has that tendency to then perseverate on some of these painful experiences, that in and of itself can magnify, right? And so that is the next scale, is through these thoughts and thinking and perceptions, to what extent might the brain have a tendency to magnify some of these painful experiences for you. And then there is the helplessness scale, right? As so when we talked about learned helplessness, right, about 2 weeks ago, and if you're interested, please refer back to that video in the email that Vanessa sent. It's a video on learned helplessness and its antidote, learned optimism, right? And so this is the tendency of the brain to feel overwhelmed by painful experiences, and being overwhelmed to the point that it's difficult to activate behavior, to engage in action, to do something about it, right? And so those are some of the things. And so if you're elevating any one of these, the high or even the moderate, these may be some things to consider about the tendency that your brain has now wired, right? Yeah, and so part of this is why I just talked about like the time since injury, right? And so the time since injury, of course, right? The more time that has elapsed, the more time that has allowed for your experiences in your environment to rewire inadvertently, unbeknownst to you, right? To rewire into these tendencies, right? And so part of that is to identify it, and you know, and because identification or early intervention or intervention begins with identification. The next scale is cog scale or cognophobia. And so this essentially is the hesitancy to engage cognitively uh, and exert cognitive effort for the fear of exacerbating symptoms, right? And so and part of this whole process is you know, maybe at initial that was adaptive, right? You're taking care of yourself, all right, well, I got to take a rest, and that rest, that relative rest, should be only in the first day or two. I think now the the um, the guidelines, right, the from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine that we had introduced in the first week or two, have recommended a period of relative rest of 1 to 2 days. And for many of us who have had injury, there is the antiquated opinion that we may have gotten from you know, healthcare providers, that you rest, complete rest, until you feel better. And so now a couple years into that research and looking into that, turns out that that's actually dangerous. And so if you've ever heard that, and I've heard that, and so it can be dangerous. And once you take the complete rest, you go into a deconditioning process, and then everything you do, it sort of elevates or exacerbates symptoms, right? So there's a hesitancy of cognitive exertion for fear of symptom exacerbation. And then the last one is the fear avoidance scale. And the fear avoidance scale is, you know, the tendency to disengage or withdraw from activities that are associated with fear consequences. And so, and of course, right? So I don't mean to downplay some of these things, because that's absolutely not what I'm trying to say here. Because clearly there are some feared consequences like death, right? That are very real, that you should definitely avoid, right? You should not, you know, run into highway, or you know, you should definitely turn off your stove, and those kinds of things. And so, or not touch a fire. I mean, those are very obvious examples, like to illustrate my point. But like, you know, if this is a broad avoidance from a whole host of activities, um, start thinking about, well, are all those activities, are they as dangerous as I think they are? And especially when pairing that with an elevated cognophobia scale, right? The hesitancy to engage cognitively, you may be withdrawing from activities that may otherwise be helpful for your recovery, right? So part of this is for us to work together to find ways to engage, right? I sound like a broken record there, right? We got to engage in COG 2.0 guidelines, cognitive rehab, right? From the top doctors that you know, meta-analyses out the wazoo, hundreds of thousands of participants, if not millions, right? All shown that in those INCOG 2.0 guidelines that we talked about in week 3 and week 4 and week 5, showed that the best cognitive rehabilitation activities involve meaningful activities to you as a survivor, daily daily ecologically valid activities and engaging in your real world activities. And so that in and of itself is cog rehab, right? I'm so proud of Rosie, right? She's engaging back in the lab, right? It's a volunteer position, but that's what you got to do, right? If this is something of value to Rosie, right, which I know it is, right, to be a clinical lab scientist, right, you've got to get back in there. You got to engage, right, do it slowly, repetitively. She was talking about electrophoresis earlier, right, and then now picking up things like, oh, if it doesn't go through, then it's too large of a
Yeah.
molecule. Yeah, absolutely, right. So I mean, those are the things you just gotta pick it up,
Yeah,
and
do
then
it.
once those, yeah,
Continue.
yeah. Go ahead, Rosie.
I was gonna say if you continue doing it, and it's in my long-term memory, I just need to get it back into my short-term.
Yeah, that's right, right? You just need to reconsolidate. And then every time you pull out that memory
Yeah,
from the long term, you reconsolidate it,
yeah.
as we talked about. What was the neural structure that consolidates, Rosie?
This is called, it's back there by your amygdala. It's called hippocampus.
Oh, perfect, man. That's perfect, Rosie. Is by the amygdala, right? She's even throwing in some new things in there, right? I didn't teach you that. Or maybe I did. But yeah, that's exactly right. It's by the amygdala. Right, exactly. So, and every time you recall a memory, it's got to be reconsolidated by the hippocampus, right, which is close to the amygdala, which is the neural emotion center,
Yeah,
the limbic area. And then, when every time you reconsolidate a long term memory, you make that bridge stronger, right? So, so thinking of that way, you keep doing electrophoresis and you keep pulling out that memory to reconsolidate it. You do that enough times, then you can do electrophoresis in your sleep.
yeah. And like, maybe down the long-term goal, I want to be heading towards my PhD in genetics, not like detrimental neuroscience, but another area.
Ooh, yeah, clapping, right? Big ups to you, Rosie,
Yeah,
right? We should, I'm trying to go back for my PhD. That's right. That's what I'm talking about, right? So absolutely, right? And it's possible. It's completely possible.
yeah,
And then once you're on that road, then I mean then it's hard to stop. Using myself as an example.
yeah,
um, so now what do we do about it, right? I think if you're elevated or high on any one of these, we gotta avoid the avoidance, right? So I mean, how often? I mean, yeah, we thinking about these, right? Where we start here, right, with pain. I'm like, oh, I'm in pain, so of course I'm gonna rest. And then when you rest too long, then you actually become stiffer. Your muscles atrophy, right? I mean, I don't know if anyone does any kind of muscle building or bodybuilding or like working out or goes to the gym frequently with like weight training. If you go a week, 2, 3, 4 weeks without lifting weights, you all those, I guess if you want to call them gains, will go away, right?
yeah,
And then once that goes away, then lifting the same weight becomes impossible or more painful, and then you do it less because you can't do it as much, then lose fitness, and then that's even more painful, and then that starts back the pain, and then this whole cycle continues and continues and continues, right? Similarly with fatigue, right? Tiredness. I know in the afternoon session, and I'll and ask them about this, right? When you're tired, right? A lot of them have sleep as improving sleep as a goal. So tiredness, right? When you're tired, and so you take a nap during the day because you only slept 2 or 3 hours at night. Then by 4 p.m. you got to take a nap, and then that disrupts your ability to fall asleep in the nighttime. And then moving is more tiring, and then all of those things start that spiral downward. So how can we avoid avoidance, right? It's through pacing, right? And so those small repeated steps, right, as we talked about it, it's just the small repeated visits to the limit, right? And so there's one, right? And I'm very guilty of this, especially because I'm not as religious as I should be with, strength and weight training. So this quite literally what happens is it's they call it the boom bust, right? Which actually leads to gradual worsening over time, and it has, and I know this has. And so clearly, I have to apply pacing to what I'm doing, and I always have to keep in mind that pacing a little bit is better than nothing, right? So for the days that you feel great, you do a whole bunch, and then you're like, oh wow, and then for the next day, next 2-3 days you're spent, and then on day 4 or 5, oh, I feel much better. And then you do it again, and then 2, 3, 4, 5 days later you're spent, and then you're like, oh, I feel great on day 6 or week 7. Shoot up, and then you do a whole bunch, and then that puts you back down. That leaves you flat for another 3, 4, 5 days, or maybe a week or 2, maybe 3, maybe a month, right? And then when really the other way is the pacing pattern, where it's just little bits here, right? So that way, there's just a little bit of decline. So the next time, then 2 days or next day, you can get back on it, and then you rest for a little bit, then get for next day, and then do a little bit more, right? Repeated visits to your limit, right? And then to ultimately improve the overall performance of your overall performance. So instructions, right, for pacing. And so every body is going to be different, and hence this is an importance of a therapist, right? Some people, great, I'm disciplined, I got this, I can do this, I'm confident, they're confident in themselves, and so I don't need anybody, I don't need nobody, I can do this myself, which is fantastic. If you can do that, that's great, right? So find a comfortable starting point, right? And so, but for other people, or maybe those who are like, oh, I'm actually not sure if maybe could I benefit from, getting a therapist, and or a trainer or a therapist, right? So these are, because sometimes, there's some things that it's difficult to do by yourself. Like if I could do this by myself, I would have done it, right? And so this could be your occupational therapist, a physical therapist, a speech therapist, a psychotherapist, a counselor, a trainer, personal trainer, right? And depending on the intensity, and accessibility of, I should say, intensity, right? You can either go with a full-on therapist or a trainer, even, right? Or even, and then at the lowest end, there's a friend, right? And then, of course, that is going to be significantly impacted by the social determinants of health that we talked about in week 1, right? Accessibility is not always possible, right? My insurance won't pay for that, or I don't have the resources for that, or those, I live in a rural community, I don't geographically live in an accessible way that I can get there, I don't have a caregiver, so I don't have rides to get there, I don't have a car, I don't have transportation. There's all these different things, the social determinants of health, that impact your accessibility of these things. And so if you're there, that's an incredibly valid point. And so those are in those NASEM guidelines, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Those are in those guidelines that we talked about, right? And so, first choose an activity, right? And of course, the activity is not just any activity. I would highly suggest, encourage, and recommend that the activity that you choose is a personally meaningful activity that is associated or related to your goal, right? And so, I don't, sitting, walking, mowing the grass, those are related to your goal, to each their own. And so 2 is to measure the length of time that you're able to comfortably do this, right? And so someone in the afternoon session was noticing, based on their journal, that if they walk over 30 minutes, then they have this boom, boom, the boom bust, right? 30 minutes, then I'm spent, right? So then we talked about, well, what about 15 minutes? And then if you're doing great on that, how about 2 bursts, 2 sessions of 15 minutes each? Does that result in the same boom bust kind of pattern, right? And so, and then doing this at least 3 separate times, right, on good days and bad days, so that way we can kind of get a good measure of the baseline. And so take the average of these times and then subtract a fifth. And so, and that way, the example here is sitting, but I would highly recommend, encourage, and highly recommend and encourage this to be something a little bit more aligned with your goal that is personally meaningful. So that way, here is time, right? But this could be repetitions. This could be the number of, balls thrown or what have you. So what time is just a very easy comparison to make across a variety of activities. So whatever it is that you would like to do to scale this, use these steps to establish a baseline. And so this could be what we're talking about today, right? Establishing a baseline in your social communication, right? How if you're an introvert or an extrovert, you may have varying, vastly different capacities to engage in conversation with other people, right? It's either I can talk for hours, right? It's getting me to stop talking is the problem. Or going out for an introvert who goes out and talks to other people after 15-20 minutes, that's it. And so part of this is to now evaluate what your social interaction is with not only the one relationship that you decided to invest some time in this week, but your entire social environment. So that could be your neighbors, your coworkers, whoever's in your day program, whoever's at your work, or whoever's in your home, or whoever's at your therapy sessions. And so to be able to identify, well, how am I relating and how am I investing my time to be social in my social relationships? Am I doing a boom bust pattern, or am I doing a pacing pattern? Right. And so part of that is, well, with social activity, if you have a boom bust pattern, on days, weeks where on your or months where you're on the bust pattern, you may be disengaging, withdrawing, and isolating. And so to really talk about that, oh, oh, all right, gonna stop that here, and we're gonna watch this video really quick. So I'm gonna stop the recording. Right. Right. And so, as she was kind of talking about, like neuroplasticity is that ability to reconnect and make those connections tighter. Right. Inflammation is one of the things that can loosen those connections, as well as the difficulties in the withdrawing and its disengagement and isolation. Recall that neuroplasticity, while it's good here in this context, it can also be a bad thing, right? That negative plasticity or the maladaptive plasticity that we talked about a week or 2 weeks ago, right? And so part of neuroplasticity and increasing that is to increase the neural cognitive reserve. And so cognitive reserve is basically like she was saying, is that backup generator, basically, where if you take steps to maintain a brain healthy life, right, those 5 brain health pillars. Pillar 1, physical activity, exercise. Pillar 2, diet, nutrition. Pillar 3, sleep, high quality sleep. Pillar 4, stimulation, cognitive stimulation, mental health stimulation. And 5 is social connectedness. And if we can do these things and maintain them, we will not only increase our cognitive reserve, right, which helps us be resilient in the face of let's say another injury or another head trauma, or other social isolation pieces or periods where we have to rest and that kind of thing. And so neuroplasticity allows us that capacity to not only improve our cognitive reserve, but also to manage and improve our stress, right? And then We all know, we just talked about, I think, was that last week, 2 weeks ago, chronic stress that is constant is not only does it feel bad, it's bad for you, right? It affects your neural structures, affects that maladaptive plasticity, it affects your capacity to stay motivated, and a whole host of other negative things, and and it goes down to like your HPA axis, and then the release of human glucocorticoids or cortisol, and then all of that wear and tear that it does physiologically. So at this point, we're getting back into social cognition, speaking with others, being around others, that fifth brain health pillar, social connectedness, right? It's the whole idea that speech and language can be a strong proxy for your cognition, right? So, for example, the multifocal nature of TBI, right? Depending on where you got hit, how fast you going, where were you, were there twisting and turning, was there loss of consciousness, and depending on where you got hit in your brain, was it the frontal, the back, the side, parietal, temporal, right? Did it go midbrain, right? Did it result in an open skull or a closed skull? So all these things and all these different factors can obviously result in a very complex, complicated interplay of cognitive, physical, behavioral, emotional, linguistic, and psychosocial sequelae, right? And so the ability to communicate successfully underpins one's capacity to develop and maintain relationships, find new friends, and for those of you who are interested, romantic partners, and even take part in things like academic, vocational, like getting back into work, and even leisure activities, right? It takes a lot of cognition to play even like a rec sport, right? You gotta keep track of who's on your team, what's the score, what's the strategy, right, for winning, right? And all of these abilities can be significantly impacted by a brain injury, right, which often causes cognitive impairments, also known as cognitive communication disorder. And so cognitive communication disorders are pretty common after severe TBI. I'm doing air quotes. And so severe TBI, or the involved TBI, it occurs in some estimates as high as 70% of people experiencing some level of communication disability as a result of their injury. So to illustrate that, right? So you can raise your hand, right? Give me a head nod. And so experienced one or more of these, right? So just give me a nod, right? And so like flat affect, word finding difficulties, right? I can't find where it's at, right? Inability to generate or maintain topics in conversation, right? Or it's too excessive, right? Some people tell me that I'm too talkative, or that I'm tangential and I get off topic pretty quickly, right? Something, I'm telling a story, and something in that story reminds me about another story, and then some in that other story reminds me of another story, and another story, another story, another story, and then 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes later, I don't even know where I'm at or what my point was, right? Yeah, head nods, thumbs up on that, right? It's difficult, right? These communication topics, right? And they're subtle, and the like, while the words can be good, it makes sense, the sentences are all grammatically correct, it's the long-term endurance to ensure the connection and the planning and the um, and the relationship of all of the things that you're sharing, right? And then of course the domination of talking time and conversations, or even sometimes repetitiveness, right? I mean, I can't remember this. Sometimes I'll be talking to my wife and you say, yeah, you said that already. Yeah, you said that already. Oh, did I? Okay, well then I'm just repeating it for emphasis, right? Yeah, Kat, you had a question there, Kat?
Actually, just a huge thank you for this, because I am subject to pretty much all of these. And this is why I tend to go for social
Yeah.
isolation, can't say the word. So
Yeah. Social
isolated
isolation.
socially.
Yeah.
Because these things make me afraid to put myself out there, and get the eye rolls and the like, would you hurry it up types of things. So thank you for putting
Yeah.
all that in one concise thing. That was it.
Yeah, that's beautiful, beautifully said, Kat. I think that's the for a lot of the high. Oh well, you look fine. Yeah, I know, but it's like these cognitive communication difficulties. Then I get failure everywhere, and everyone looking at me funny and things like that, and I'm not connecting, and so the real purpose of me social connectedness, I'm defeating that whole purpose, because it's not, and if anything, it's making me feel worse. And then because of that, you isolate, right? And then isolate, and we just had a whole video and things on like what happens with the isolation, and so those kind of communication difficulties, I can't. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there, Kat, right? And it's difficult because these social communication functions, they're they're so involved that these are basically executive functions, and executive functions, as we've been raising them, right, like measuring them with like some of the standard tests, like set shifting or trails, or your ability to say numbers backwards, or connect the number of bubbles from letters to numbers and shifting back between those, like so how much are you losing, right, of that? Are you really capturing that social communication subtlety difficulty after 5 or 10 minutes by doing those kind of tasks? And um I would say no. And so, I and actually I got a PhD and then a postdoctoral training in clinical neuropsychology to be able to answer that question. And so, right, because I think someone, right, I think Rosie, right, you're laughing. I think someone brought it up maybe 5 or 6 years ago and asked the question. I don't know. I'm going to go find out. So whoever that was, I need to tell them the answer is no. So perfect. Yeah, Pam, you had a question there.
Yes, thank you so much for bringing these up, and for having so many specific signs and symptoms
Oh,
for
I got
us
more.
for us to identify. Well, that's great, and keep up the broken record. I think we should give you a platinum album for that, and it has really saved my life. So thank you. The thing that I wanted to say, two things. The first one is, I didn't realize that I had these signs and symptoms until they were brought forward to me, and then I observed myself and people's reactions to me. So
Yeah.
it took a while. I didn't think there was that many things wrong with me
Yeah.
until I saw them, and then paid attention to maybe why people's reactions to me were a certain way that wasn't conducive to me continuing to interact socially. So it was great to identify those. That was number one.
Yeah.
And then the feeling of I was mortified when I realized, oh my gosh, that's me. So that was important for me to feel, like it brought some humility to me, and then a willingness to look at how to do things differently. That was my process for that, and I am grateful to continue growing in that area. The other thing
Beautiful.
thank you. Thank you for having these spaces for us to do that. The other
Absolutely.
thing I wanted to say is, what was really important for me is to choose my companions with care.
Ooh,
That's
I
even
like
more
that.
important. Yeah, that's even more important for me now. And that is another thing I've added to my gratitude list for my TBI. like before I found out how injured I am, I wasn't that careful, and I kind of looked at the outside things, the sparkly things, the things that society told me are important with regard to who I wanted friendships with. But now, after coming to Friday group for so long and what learning what my values are, and then I'm really picky now about who can be my friend.
Yeah, that's
And
right. You can't sit with us.
yeah, if you can't be nice and all inclusive and have an open mind and and encourage growth in yourself and others, you can't sit with me. I like
And I
that, Dan.
love that. I love that, right? Is choose your companions with care. Love
Yes,
that.
and it's because I love myself and my brain now. Like I appreciate it so much more now since so much of it was gone. I have to be even more cognizant of its preciousness and my preciousness. So anyway, I'll stop there and thank you again for bringing these things up because it's always good to have them in front of me. Thank you.
Right. It's
Okay.
absolutely, it's so important, right? And so and like I think you and Kat bring up such an important point is like the social cognition and the competence, right? To be able to cognition and emotions and being affective, the cognitive component, the affective component, these really lay the foundation for more complicated things like like having that social cognition, dealing with people. We live in 2025 now, and so the physical nature of it is not, maybe not as important now. We've kind of got virtual avenues now, but nonetheless, whether it's in person or if it's over a screen, we still have to deal with people, right? And that's like an inseparable part of life, right? Dealing with others. And so having that social cognition is basically the gatekeeper to not only having good working relationships with people, and then that's in the home where you feel safe, you feel validated, you feel expressed, you feel loved, or relationships at work or at school, or where you're feeling you're feeling valued, you're feeling you're feeling successful. And then there's also the leisure activities where you're able to connect with others and collaborate, right? And so if you're not having good social cognition and not very good competence, that negatively impacts your capacity to engage in everything, right? And so what we're referring to here is that emotional perception and emotional empathy, and being able to then take those things in real time based on someone's nonverbals, verbals, the context, the situation, right? And be able to integrate all those things at the same time to inform what you're going to say next, right? And so that's highly complicated. That's highly complicated. I'm getting a headache just thinking about all the things that have to happen everyone like to have successful social communications. Right? I think that's why so many people don't like them, right? Because it's so involved. But really understanding the thoughts and beliefs of other people, as the video just said, was referred to theory of mind. And so I think that's an important kind of concept here as we're talking about social competence, is the theory of mind. And it's the slowed capacity to understand others' thoughts and beliefs. And then because that's slowed understanding, because connectivity, you have to integrate a whole bunch of things, then you have to use all those to now inform what you're going to say next. And a theory of mind that's impacted is going to impact not only the theory of mind inside, but then the output when it comes to speaking, right? And so and speaking in a relevant way. And so, speaking of those, how can we evaluate these aspects of social cognition? And so, this might be emotional perception, theory of mind that we were just talking about, emotional empathy, perspective taking, social behavior. And so these are things that, neuropsychologists can be trained to evaluate effectively. Not everyone of us is nor have interest in doing so. And these are a little bit additional to some of the standardized tests that are frequently used in our field. And so in COG 2.0 guidelines, computerized social treatments are not really recommended given the lack of evidence of generalization to real life activities, right? So the things that we do with computer cognition, unless it's like, here where, there's several of us in a room and we can interact and raise hands, and interact with each other. If it's a computerized generated, then that doesn't, the research doesn't show evidence to support that generalization happens. Therefore, the improvement to real life activities is likely limited. Yes, Grace, you had a question.
I'm gonna make a long story short. I'm on the Amtrak train right now, heading to New Orleans.
Ooh, okay,
Yes,
headed for Mardi Gras.
yes, for Mardi Gras. But what I want to share is I did my homework last week. I Everything I need to pack. Okay, from everything from like a shoe or socks, everything to medication. I put
Love that.
everything in my cell phone in the notes. Okay, as I pack, I put it down. As I pack, I put it down. Okay, so this is going to be my master list if I
Yes.
need to go to another future traveling.
Ooh,
This
love
is a
that.
big challenge for me. And then also this train trip is a little bit different because we got a sleeper section. So you have very limited item in the room. So you have your luggage compartment, and you also have to bring a little duffel bag in the room. So you have to separate what I need to bring in the room. So you know what I'm saying? So you have to go list, item by item. Okay, I need to take a shower, so I need to take this. I can, I can go to my luggage to access, but it's a trouble. Okay, so I made a list, a, a master list, the things I have to pack, every single item, and then I checked off.
Yeah. Wow. That's great. And so how was that for you, having that list, being able to then now be ready and pack and ready for your trip?
A couple of times I have to walk away because I get frustrated and my head get tired. I
Yeah.
have to walk away, and then and then so I can I sit down and rest, and then I write it, and right away I think about something, and then I type on my list on my phone, because the last time I mentioned I always carry a phone in the pouch with. So I just take out from the pouch and I write it down. I listed everything I need to bring. So, and so I start packing and I check off the list.
Wow. Yeah, and ultimately that has helped you with make sure that you're ready for your trip.
Yes, and then also this master list is really helpful, so I know what I need to bring, so I don't miss anything.
Boom. Beautiful. Beautiful, man. I'm clapping for you. Round of applause there,
Thank you.
Grace.
But anyway, yeah, we got on the train last night, and so we left at 16, which was yesterday, from Pomona Station, and
Yeah.
we're coming back on 26 for two days on the train going, 2 days coming back, and 5 days in New Orleans.
Ooh, Mardi Gras, man. I love
Yes,
that beat. Please
yeah.
be safe.
Yes, well, my son and then my grandson is with us too, so
Ooh,
that's another help. But I don't want to be dependent on him. I want to be,
yes.
independent. So I want to pack very careful.
Yes, and I love that. Love that. You have a master list, right? So now Grace has now extended a strategy to the strategy that she used to help pack was use her journal, right? That notebook to create a list, right? And now it has now dual purpose now that she's on her trip, because then she's going to take that same list that helped her with this trip and now generalize it to use that same list for her next trip and the next trip and the next trip.
Yes.
Perfect, man. I love that, right? Generalizing. That's what the INCOG 2.0 guidelines was saying, right? With cognitive rehabilitation should happen in real world activities, right? To generalize to meaningful activities and tasks to those that we trying to survivors, right?
Yes, and also try to be socializing. I don't want to be stay home all the time. I want to
Yeah.
go out, see the world.
Yeah, man, I love that, man. That's awesome. Man, go see the world, right? I was actually in New Orleans just this past weekend. I was there for a conference, but I got to catch the opening Mardi Gras parade, and it was beautiful. So
Oh,
yeah,
great.
it was very stimulating. So make sure to pace, right? So that way you
Yes.
don't get the boom bust pattern. Make sure to pace, right?
Yes.
So take rest frequently, drink lots of water. It gets hot.
Yes, yes, yes.
And I also love that is she's now socializing that fifth brain health pillar, social connectedness, right? She's with her loved ones, her family. And so love that, Grace. Love that for you. So
Thank
keep us
you. Thank you.
updated on your progress.
Sure will. Sure will.
Yeah, send us pictures, right? If you have any.
Oh, yeah.
That's,
Yes.
oh, that's beautiful. Thank you,
It's
Grace.
it's a bunk bed, so I slept on the bunk on the top. My husband was at below.
Well, that's perfect, and thank you for sharing that, Grace.
Thank
That's
you.
exciting. That's so exciting. That's so exciting. And so, as we're talking about, right? So with loved ones, right? So whether you're with your son or your grandson or your friend or your parents or other loved ones, right? Some of the communication problems described by loved ones with TBI. And so, if you've had any one of these said to you, maybe a hand raise, head nod, right? Egocentric, unresponsive to social cues, right? Like I'm upset, you can tell like I'm upset and they're not responsive to the social cues. Oh man, you missed the mark. I was saying this, meaning I was actually asking you to do X, Y, and Z. I'm like, well, how come you didn't just say that? Like, why you gotta imply it? Just say it, right? And so those are some of the problems that is coming with, right? Overly familiar with acquaintances, right? And so this can happen, right? If you have those. And so I'm a very huggy person, and so I, instead of being weird about it, I just embrace it. And so that's just how I cope with my injury, right? And then violating social conventions like norms for interpersonal space. And so other ones, right? And this one I find pretty frequently across a number of people, which I'm not sure if it's strictly restricted to TBI, but it's definitely, I hear it a lot more in survivors of brain injury, is quick to anger, right? Who has this, right? It's like, oh man, I can go completely fine to yelling in like 2 seconds, right? I get mad so fast, right? Like that, what is they call paroxysmal, right? And so that may be the ones I see head nods there. Yeah, quick to anger, right? And so cognitive. Oh yes, Pam.
Oh, yes, thank you. The communication problems described by loved ones, is this by the caregivers that notice these things? Or is this
Yeah.
great? Oh, thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Yes. So I
Yes,
mean, these
I
are
okay.
this list is not exhaustive, of course, right? So I mean, these are just some things that commonly come up, right? And tossed to the quick to anger one, right? So I mean,
Yes.
yeah, but you're exactly right, Pam. So these are
Oh, great.
reported by caregivers. Yes.
So in the new caregiver group, maybe we'll get even more, and I could check off each one of these on the list. So I so appreciate this because I can now tend to these things in a little more detail, and also ask God for help, for
Yes.
awareness, and I just, on my prayer, I ask him, God, to direct my thinking and give my attention to where it needs to be. And then I
Absolutely.
notice
Absolutely.
some help with that. Okay, thank you.
Oh,
Sorry, thank you.
absolutely. I mean, the spiritual piece is a thing that is not even in here, right? So the spiritual piece that you're referring to is a whole nother layer of like motivation and understanding and meaningfulness for some people, right? It's not across the board, unfortunately, but for some people it is. It's a huge
Yeah.
thing. I mean, for me, right, that serenity prayer is gold, right?
Yeah.
And God grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, the strength to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Love that, man. Love that, Pam. And so as we're kind of talking, right, as that just reminds me, right, as also a big shout to Caitlin, right, who will be heading our upcoming, it's a new brain injury specific caregiver support group for your caregivers. So if you're sitting next to your caregiver, or you have a caregiver, or your loved one, your parent, your son or daughter, and so we have a new brain injury caregiver specific group starting in honor of Brain Injury Awareness Month, which is March, just coming up right around the corner. Right? The first one will be on Monday, March the 10th from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. And so that'll happen every second and fourth Monday of the month. So Caitlin, shouts to you. Thank you. I see you in here. Perfect. So excellent. Now, cognitive communication, INCOG 2.0, that this number one is the number one guideline is those engaged in rehabilitation should recognize that levels of communication and communication competence will vary with who they're talking to, where they are, what's the demands. Are you at work or school, or at home, or are you at church? What's your priorities, right? Are you at a shopping grocery store, right? How fatigued are you? Is this in the beginning of the day, in the middle of the day, or the end of the day, right? Those physical and sensory issues. Are you wearing your glasses or your hearing aids if you need them, right? Or are you having lighter sound sensitivity, so you need to speak a little bit softer, right? Someone's got phonophobia, they got some sensory sensitivities. Then there's the psychosocial variables, right? So the social determinants of health we were talking about earlier, right? And then there's the behavioral control issues. If you're having problems with, controlling your bodily movements, then that could also affect the way that you're communicating, because maybe there's a little bit of, nervousness or embarrassment, or even some precaution that's happening that's distracting you from communicating effectively. Same with your emotional variables, right? Maybe you're upset, or you're frustrated, or you're starting to get sensation. You can feel your fist clenching, or you're sweating a little bit, and so all that's those physical and sensory issues are all going to impact your ability to stay focused on your communication, right? uh, Guideline 2, in doing those, you also need to take things into account, like your gender identity. What are your language for native first preferred languages? So if English is not your first language, then then that's really going to complicate things, because then there's the interference kind of theory, where you take in information in, let's say, the English language, then in your head you have to translate from English to Spanish, and then from Spanish back to English to communicate, and then that delay is going to impact your communication style, right? And your effectiveness, your proficiency, right? Not everyone is completely has literacy issues, especially when it comes to health literacy. Your cognitive abilities, sometimes, because we had a little bit more conversation in this module session. I appreciate you guys persisting and sticking with me, right, with your cognitive abilities past the hour mark. And so love that. So you guys are doing great. And then gender identity. And then the fifth cognitive communication principle here is cognitive communication programs for individuals with brain injury should provide the opportunity for practicing and using communication skills in situations appropriate to the context in which the person will live, work, study, and socialize. And so love that you guys have all shown that. For everyone who spoke today, you have met this guideline perfectly. I mean, Grace is sitting in an Amtrak right now, right? She's moving, right? So I can't even say where exactly she's at, because she'll probably be in a different place at the end of the session that she was in the beginning of the session, right? And you guys are all talking about connecting with your caregivers, right? These are the communication issues that I'm having, right? So I have this at work or at school or at home or with this relationship or that relationship, right? And so the next cognitive communication principle is that clinicians should consider group therapy as an appropriate means of cognitive communication training. And that's exactly what we're doing here, right? And you're all doing beautiful, right? And I see that in the chat. You guys are very active in the chat. My apologies, I can't be so active in the chat. So Caitlin, Vanessa, please field that. And if there's something that needs to be handled or discussed outside of this or offline, then please take note of that so that we can make that contact via email once the session is over today. So where aligned with their communication goals, clinicians should consider group therapy. So ultimately, principle 7, you're all doing perfectly, right? Staying active in the chat, staying active in the discussion via this room or via the chat function. So those are all really important things. And so now all these principles, all these deficits, right? So now we're going to talk about, as she said in the video, talk about the silver lining, right? So what are some recommendations, right? So there's level A evidence for communication partner training. So this could be with, let's say, taking use of the upcoming brain injury specific caregiver group, right? It's all about improving and enhancing communication, right, with your loved ones. So, you can put the interest in communication partner training in the chat. Caitlin will invite your loved one to the caregiver group, and then we'll begin that kind of training to ensure that your caregiver or your loved one and you are taking steps to the most effective communication, right? And so such an important part, right? Because the strategies and metacognitive awareness training, so important, right? And metacognition, those strategies, we must have talked about them in 3 or 4 different weeks by this point. So please continue to monitor and use them weekly, right? Because you're only gonna get better if you practice it, right? And so reintegration into your daily functions, right? I love that. The Amtrak, going to work, volunteering, I saw in the chat. That's huge. Volunteering, right? That gives a low, there's a low stakes, low pressure way for you to get engaged, and you can help the community, right? I can't tell you, I also just doing that data analysis in the background of this presentation also, but the social resources, like the density of service provision organizations like 501c3s, nonprofits, the density, right, per 1,000 individuals in a neighborhood, that was associated with improvements in brain injury outcomes, both microstructure and both in behavior, both in cognition, right, and in cognition. So the reintegration into daily activities is such an important thing, right? And now we have data that shows that exact thing, right? And now communication coping treatment, right? And so these are some things that you can bring up to, let's say, a speech therapist or to an actual therapist that you're with. Focus on confidence, self-esteem, identity formation. We do that here. Man, you guys are doing great, right? With your goals, we talk about them either now or in the afternoon session, right? And so lastly is provision of education and information regarding the nature of acquired cognitive communication disorders to survivors and their loved ones. We're doing that here. We're doing that now in this cognitive workshop series. And then to your loved ones, we're going to do that for your loved ones on March 10th and the fourth Monday of the month from 5:30 p.m. to 6:30 p.m., right? And so again, lastly, of course, these are the metacognitive strategies. So you could raise your hand, nod your head so we can just get through these. These are some of the metacognitive strategies that we talked about that maybe like if you've done these, right? Self-questioning, yeah, see that. So it's the planning, goal setting, right? Monitoring your thinking. How did I do? What was the outcome? What did I reflect on? How did I do that? Self-regulation, was I getting upset? Did I do that effectively? Did I walk away in time? Right? Making connections, right? Does this tell me about new old information? Is there any old information that I can bring into new tasks? And Grace did that beautifully, right? She made a list for this trip that she's going to keep for the next trip and the next trip and the next trip, right? And then those cognitive reframes. And I love that, Pam, right? Thinking about how you can changing how you think about a situation, right? Instead of thinking, oh, I'm failing in all these different things, I'm failing with all my loved ones, I'm failing in all these relationships when I'm talking to them, but really now to use cognitive restructuring to conceptualize that, okay, no, there are just some bumps that I have to even out, and the bumps will be easier to even out when both myself and my loved ones, my communication partners, both know what to look for, right? And so same with Kat, right? So and you know, I wish you well on that, Kat, right? Because all too often that happens, all too often, right? Is all of these cognitive communication disorders happen and then impacts all my relationships, and then you know, social interactions, I start feeling a certain way, and so because of that I just like and I do away with the whole thing, and then I isolate and I withdraw, and if we withdraw and isolate, then we continue with pacing, right? How can we get over that? Get over it with pacing, right? So then, because when we find the withdrawal, the pain and fatigue cycle here, we can actually draw one in the center here for withdrawal, right? I withdraw, and because I withdraw, I don't connect, I don't engage, and part of that is not engaging is making me worse. And then when I'm worse, that gets me even more anxious to connect socially, and then I'm withdrawn. And then that happens over and over again, right? So we can have here. I have for pain. I have fatigue. We can have one for withdrawal. We can have one for cognitive symptoms, right? We can. This is applicable to all of the things that we were discussing earlier: the pain catastrophizing, the cognophobia scale, right? The fear avoidance, right? And how we can avoid the avoidance with pacing, right? Avoid the boom bap pattern in favor of the pacing pattern, right? And of course, here, lastly, we recognize that a person's cognitive communication ability should not be evaluated and treated as an isolated skill, but rather should be viewed within the broader context of the person's everyday needs and systems. And the systems that we're referring to are, you know, your coworkers, your providers, your healthcare providers, your loved ones, your family, right? Your relationships. And, you know, and if we're talking about our relationships, the homework for this week is to pick 2 relationships to invest more time in, right? Because, you know, a healthy brain needs healthy relationships. Thank you. So excellent. I wish y'all well.